Welcome back, everyone. So let's fast forward it and assume we've completed our HIA, we've just finished the assessment, and we are at the recommendation step. The purpose of recommendation step of the HIA process is to develop health-based recommendations and a feasible plan for implementing them. So in summary, this is when the HIA team and stakeholders are developing practical solutions that can be implemented within the political, economic, or technical limitations of the project or policy to minimize those identified health risks and maximize those potential health benefits. Recommendations are where we really seek to identify those specific actions, as I just mentioned. These should be developed for each impact that you identified. So think back to the assessment step where we identified health impacts. We want to develop recommendations for each of those impacts. The development of recommendations should be guided by the evidence. It is really important to develop recommendations based on what we found versus recommendations that kind of seem to come out of nowhere. The recommendations can include alternatives to the decision, modifications to the proposal, or some mitigation measures, and we'll talk through some examples of those in a moment. And I hope it goes without saying, but I will say it. When we develop recommendations, we should not introduce any negative health impacts, right? So again, we're trying to maximize those positive ones, minimize those negative ones, and also not introduce new negative health impacts. It's possible that an HIA might not provide any recommendations. I just want to say that. It's really rare, though, if your scoping is done well. If you go through an analysis and the HIA failed to reveal any important health effects, or that the HIA was really sort of more one-sided and there's no recommendations, I might have said to you that you probably shouldn't have done that HIA in the first place. So when we have scoping, or when scoping is done really well, we end up with HIA with recommendations. When we develop recommendations, we need to think about feasibility, cost effectiveness, political acceptability, and efficiency. Again, I mentioned earlier, this is not about doing some academic exercise. We want to develop recommendations that can be implemented. Ideally, the recommendations should be developed with input from the stakeholders who we engage in the HIA process. It's also important to develop an implementation plan for each recommendation, and then to tie those recommendations to indicators that we identify during the assessment step, so that way we can monitor and evaluate the HIA and the HIA outcomes, and we'll talk about monitoring and evaluation in a future module. Here are some key points about recommendations. Based on HIA research that I've done and others have done, we know that recommendations are most effective when developed in collaboration with the community and the decision maker. Because when we do that, the recommendations end up accounting for sort of those real-time political contexts, those real-time economic contexts. Another important thing about recommendations is that they should be written with the implementation context in mind. So for example, will the recommendations be implemented through a zoning ordinance, a new regulation, a voluntary agreement with the developer? We also want to write them in a way that the decision maker knows what to do and can implement them. And the recommendations can address health outcomes or address those health determinants, so they can be focused really around those social determinants of health. Here are just a few examples when we think about ways to implement recommendations. I won't go through all of these, but let me highlight a few. So for example, if the recommendation or if the proposal the HIA was applied to was around legislation, one way that you might develop the recommendation is to suggest that that proposed legislation be modified in a way to help promote positive health and help minimize harm. Or if the proposal is around zoning requirement, we might have an example where we're going to impose some permit requirements or something related to the zoning, and so you'd have your recommendation that would be really specific to that. You might have a regulation and have some very specific monitoring requirements, for example. It's really important to think through implementation because I want to highlight one thing about HIA that I hope is really clear. If we as public health people are conducting HIAs on decisions in other sectors, we have to write the recommendations in a way that individuals in these other sectors can implement them and can change those proposals, for example. So what happens is most times is, let's say I work at a health department and I'm doing the health impact assessment with my colleagues in transportation and it's on a transportation decision. They're going to be the ones, those in the transportation sector, to implement those recommendations. So we have to understand how those decisions are made in the transportation sector in order to inform those recommendations. There are a number of HIAs that have been completed that we've seen actual pragmatic actions that have resulted from them. And here are just a few. One, an HIA ended up making a recommendation to dedicate land in a community for new community gardens or farmers' gardens to address resident access to fresh produce, which the assessment showed was severely lacking in a particular community. So in that HIA, one of the recommendations was create space, dedicate land in order for community gardens to be developed to address that lack of access that, again, came out of the assessment phase. A second example is an HIA showed that noise was a big problem around a new building development. So part of the recommendations was to create noise and implement noise reduction measures such as soundproofing the buildings or to redesign the streets to reduce traffic speed. So again, these are recommendations that came out of the assessment where the data showed that noise was going to be a big problem around changing this built environment. There are a number of HIAs that have addressed the built environment where we've seen plans, master plans, or some other plan for a community make recommendations to changing pedestrian and bicycling infrastructure. So there might be specific recommendations around creating sidewalks or improving sidewalks, putting in new bike lanes, or putting in new speed bumps or speed humps to slow down traffic. Again, these are very specific recommendations that came out of the assessment of the HIA that showed increased risk to pedestrians and bicyclists from changing the built environment. Creating recommendations is an art similar to drawing those pathway diagrams that I talked about earlier. It's really important that your recommendations are based in the evidence, are tied to the assessment phase that we just talked about, and are written in a way that they can be implemented. Because we know that when recommendations are implemented in a way, written in a way that can be implemented, they are indeed more likely to be implemented by decision makers. So that concludes my very brief overview of the recommendation step of the HIA process. I want to encourage you to take a look at these slides again, look at the resources, and look at the minimum elements guidelines that I showed you earlier to help you be really clear on the types of things that we should be thinking about during the recommendation step. So we will come back shortly and talk about the next step of the HIA process, which is reporting.